Gamchi Lakwan, y'all. That is what's up in Kalapuya. Since we at Lane Community College are on Kalapuya land, I thought it appropriate, since we were talking about today, an Indigenous perspective on Thanksgiving, that we at least use the language that was spoken for at least 10,000 years before today here. I'll introduce our guest, but if you are tuning in to DiversiTV for the first time, welcome. And if you are our growing legion of fans, welcome back. Tonight, as I said, we're looking at an Indigenous perspective on Thanksgiving with our guest, who I'll introduce shortly. But what DiversiTV is about, our mission, is to illuminate everyday diversity issues and give the mic and the camera to those who don't always get it. And because any given particular people have diverse views, the views of our guests are to be taken as examples of possible human viewpoints rather than indicative of any one group. So in terms of looking at diversity as an issue, how we characterize it here at Lane is not just the, for example, to be seen as our schedule, which we usually start out the first show each season. We're in the 5th season, which roughly corresponds to an LCC term. So we've been doing this for almost 3 years now. October, we usually begin with Native perspective, then Anglo, because we're speaking English, African American perspective, Latino. November 5th, we did a Native prison art show. We did a gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer questioning, intersex, two-spirit perspective. Last week, we did a rerun of Margaret Johnson Bales, a native Eugene Olympian, who's one of the member of one of the pioneer African-American families here in Eugene. This week, we're doing an Indigenous Thanksgiving. Next week, we'll look at class issues, and December 10th, the end of our 5th season, we'll look at spirituality and religion. Now, what is Thanksgiving? Now, when we talk about Thanksgiving, usually what comes to mind in terms of representation in the popular mind, here you have this painting that was done, within the last century or so, I believe. I just Googled this off of the internet, and so if you see Native people sitting on the ground being served by a quote-unquote pilgrim woman, the friendly dog and the children, and the soldier at the table, rough-hewn dwellings. You also jump cut to the Norman Rockwell kind of, Americana, middle America, big turkey, grandma and grandpa at the table, smiling, scrubbed faces sitting around the table, about to enjoy a feast. And with some humor, because I had to laugh when I found this, Googling on the images. So what I like about this image, the dog dressed up as a Native person and the cat dressed up as a pilgrim, is you have these kind of stereotypical, shall we say, natural adversaries making nice. And that's one of the things that when this holiday was constructed, and we have to be honest here, it was constructed from certain historical events. So when we look at what is Thanksgiving, from an ethnic studies point of view, it's a mythological representation of certain historical events, in particular for first contacts between one indigenous nation and a group of Europeans who came to settle and eventually conquer and subdue the discovered people. So this mythological representation has come to embody a certain relationship to living systems, where those living systems are seen as resources to be controlled instead of living processes to be respected and interacted with. So our guest tonight is Dr. Michael Samano, who's coordinator of ethnic studies here at LCC. Welcome back, Michael.
Thank you.
So let's break it down. How do you approach the subject of Thanksgiving, which is a created holiday, where it's kind of all about today, food, commerce, the beginning of the shopping season, day before Black Friday, in which, profitable Friday, with what it would mean to Indigenous people and what they would celebrate?
I tend to compartmentalize the holiday into exactly what you were just talking about. So I have my childhood memories of the rickety card table, and so at some point you're kind of too old to be at that table, but you're waiting for room at the big table. So
the kids are at the card table.
And you've got the little juice ring around your face, and you're trying to mimic what you should or shouldn't be doing at the table, and the honor of family showing up / tension of family showing up. How long will they stay, and when will they go away? And football, and then, like you said, shopping, and then kind of as an adult and with my own family, how we interpret that holiday. And then, there's I think the whole ethnic studies kind of slant to it. So the things that I've learned in school through scholarship or through additional lived experience with other folks, and then trying to perhaps see it as a holiday where there's time to get together to gather and just give thanks, even though I think that probably gathering and giving thanks is something that many of us do throughout the year, but for some reason there's this one day that we can really play it up. So I think that I'm able to honor Thanksgiving, or say we do Thanksgiving, or joke about it in the house saying it's Thanks-taking or whatever. But I can also honor the real story, or more real story, I guess, the other, kind of more hidden truths about what happened with contact between Indigenous people and Europeans. And so, I mean, it means all those things, at least for me and my reckoning.
Yeah. And it's not like we're trying to put a damper on people's celebration, but let's put it in a larger context. So our president-elect, not to date this show too much, but our president-elect, instead of having dinner at home, though they might do that, they're going to a soup kitchen, taking Sasha and Malia to a soup kitchen, feed the homeless and the needy, et cetera, as a cool example. And much has been made of, as we were talking before we came on, much has been made, and the president-elect has been making a lot of, political hay with, the relationship of Lincoln, and basically selecting his cabinet of adversaries, and that the whole Lincoln-esque thing. And one of the things that you mentioned was that it was Lincoln who kind of created the idea of the holiday. Talk some more about that.
Here we are in the 1860s, in a war environment, or warring environment.
Yeah, well, we're in a war now too.
So
right.
Whether it's the now or the past, and in this sense that what do we need to do to bind the country together, in some sort of sense of patriotism. And of course, at that time, we have the Civil War. And so here we have Abraham Lincoln, basically with his government and the people of that time inventing this national holiday. So it's not that Indigenous people didn't break bread with Europeans, because even if we go back to that first image that you showed with the kind of traditional looking Pilgrims and the Indigenous people in what became the New England states, they, from what I've read, they did sit and break bread together. Now, they were sitting and breaking bread together because at that time there was warfare going on.
Right.
And
between them.
Yeah. So you have the Europeans coming in and exploiting the animosities between groups. And so these indigenous groups are warring with each other. And really what we find is a victory dinner, where a leader has been beheaded, and his head ends up on a spike on a fort for 25 years, which sounds disgusting to me. But, so from that first kind of symbolic war victory dinner. Then we kind of fast forward to the time of George Washington, and in that kind of colonial history, there's an observance of Thanksgiving days. And of course, prior to Europeans, we would talk about traditional peoples, not only here, but throughout the world, honoring and celebrating the shift in seasons.
Yeah.
So we fast forward all of a sudden to the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln and Thanksgiving. And a thing that surprised me in my reading was there was no emphasis on the Pilgrims, no mention of the Pilgrims. You have to start pushing out additional decades for the story that we now think is the truth.
Right.
Is something that came a little bit later.
A representation of the truth. Because, one, they didn't call themselves Pilgrims. Two, they didn't call that Thanksgiving. That was later added on. Certainly as early as 2 years later from the original, the 1621, which what they're celebrating is a war where 700 Pequot got massacred by a mixed force, and the colonists are praying, thank you, God, for having the Indians be slaughtered, enslaved, and so that we can have this land in peace, right? So, oops, and then 10 years later, then we have the native leader's son beheaded and then placed his head on the pike. So one of the interesting things in terms of, we look at Lincoln constructing this holiday for national unity, when Lincoln himself, and I guess one of the things that had been troubling me all this week, because we've been talking about Lincoln in class, in my African American class, is here you have this guy that's basically saying, okay, calling in black leaders, he's saying, like Frederick Douglass, and saying, okay, this slavery thing's going to tear us apart. So the best thing that we need to do is y'all need to leave. Black people need to leave America. That's the solution to slavery. And they leave now and go in peace, so to speak. And so this is the guy, in terms of national unity, who's constructing this disparate narrative of all these different elements here. Who are the players, and what is the situation in the larger story?
Well, I was thinking about, let's say, before we get to the players of the times of the Pilgrims or whatever, when you started talking about the Civil War in terms of this population of people who, we're not going to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, and then all of a sudden we're going to hang out with them. We want to, have them move, and it made me think about, if you look at the, let's say the 1840s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, this very robust time in our history where we're signing treaties and we're violating treaties. All of a sudden we have this new Southwest United States, and so all of a sudden we have all these indigenous people / Mexicans / mestizos / Africans who are free.
It should be
Chinese laborers coming in. We've got Irish laborers coming in. I mean, we've got all this stuff going on in this country, and for us to kind of create this myth of unity, and really, it was European superiority. I mean, because you look at the imagery of the clothed pilgrim, and then you've got these half-naked indigenous people, and somehow we've constructed this reality where there's these Europeans and they're coming and working hard and flourishing, versus these Europeans coming and starving to death and resulting to cannibalism and robbing graves for food and for utensils. And so I think in that second question, it's really in the larger story, I see this as much more symbolic of white supremacy than I do starting to talk about Squanto and some of these. Even though it's important to talk about these other people, I think that's why I look at the actual invention of the national holiday as really the first kind of place to think.
And I think it's important to basically characterize, when you use the term white supremacy, we're not talking about Klansmen and Nazis. We're talking about the idea that a certain group of people in a socially constructed category called race considers themselves superior to everybody else on the planet and then creates a culture based on that, which supplants what is there originally. And so what we're trying to get to, and so sometimes that concept of whiteness, as you mentioned, the Irish people, they were not part of that story. Right. They were not considered white. So, when we talk about, as appeared on my midterm, who is the first country to free slaves? It was not the United States. It was not Canada. It was Mexico, right? So you have mixed Europeans, natives, and Africans in a country, headed by a former slave who frees all the slaves. And that was one of the issues in all the states that are named in terms of, Spanish names. Mexico, that we acquired in the Southwest, as you talk about. So you've got those folks, Chinese immigrants. You've got a lot of, as we put it here, diversity in a country that is struggling with a lot of different things. So in the narrative of white supremacy, then certain native people kind of start sticking out as being the friendly natives that help out white people. So whether it's Pocahontas, whether it's Saga Joea, whether it's Tisquantum, who, Squanto, these people have a story that doesn't necessarily appear in that. So talk about Tisquantum.
I started thinking about, it's clear that the Europeans that came over, and specifically the Pilgrims, because the Pilgrims only made up a small percentage of the total number of Europeans that came to colonize at that time. Right. So I think it'd be easy for me to assume that they're European, they're Christians.
Yes,
they're practicing Christians, and no doubt if there were feasts of food and people sat down, most likely someone probably prayed. But there is no evidence that I'm aware of the number of indigenous people who were present who had become Christians or became baptized or whatever, and maybe signaling baptism by, say, an Anglo name or something like that. So here they are making alliances, military alliances with non-Christians in order to ultimately subjugate non-Christians.
Non-Christians, right.
And then sitting down and breaking bread, most likely with non-Christians, and then, within this narrative, there are, people who are enslaved and shipped back to Europe, kind of, on display, and that's where it kind of makes me think about this Squanto person,
right.
That a person can end up in some degree. Well, he was either a slave or an indentured servant with no timeline, and ends up in Europe. And somehow ends up, at one point in England, and then at another point in his life, I guess he's in Spain, and then he escapes and is able to make his way, I think, up into maybe Newfoundland or some area where he's able to negotiate passage back here to this continent, only to go, to his village and find that he's the last surviving member, because of disease and other things, and so he's kind of held up as this person who was really down with the Europeans and wanted to hang with them, and really I think it's an extremely flexible character, a person who was basically dealt the absolute shit into the stick, and had to decide how to survive.
Right. I mean, but, to expand upon some of the things that you talked about, he was captured, he was enslaved by Europeans, and that was actually a common practice. I mean, so the Algonquin nation for something like 600 years have been fighting not only, they're part of what was referred to as the League of the Delaware, and basically for 600 years been basically dealing with Iroquois nation, and Europeans and European fisher people, and so Tisquantum had been captured, sold into slavery, taken to England, taken to Europe, made it back here, gets within a few miles of his original village, gets captured again, sent back into slavery in Europe, makes his way back, and when he comes back to his village, everybody's gone. They're wiped out by disease, and these quote-unquote pilgrims are living there. And that usually gets conveniently left out of the narrative. But, there are other native folks that kind of get into the story or actually get left out of the story within that. So he becomes a problematic figure, when we're talking about the native perspective because, wow, he has converted or been forcibly converted to Christianity. Can we trust this guy? Yes, he can speak English, but a lot of us could speak English with others, and that was one of the surprising things to the so-called Pilgrims, who were actually Puritans, shall we say, a particular sect of Christianity, who were escaping, at least the narrative was religious persecution in England, so we are told, but they're not necessarily seeking religious freedom here. They're basically following the mythology of, we're Christians, we discovered you, so we're eventually going to, conquer your lands as, the Pope, even though they're not Catholic, the Pope said in 1493 that, it's Christians' responsibility to spread Christianity all over the planet with these particular folks. So if we're going to look at those kind of lessons in terms of how the story got changed from the historical reality, what kind of lessons can we draw from that historical reality today?
Well, it's kind of funny because, funny, haha.
Funny, peculiar.
That almost the one thing that remained constant is the ceremonial food around Thanksgiving. Mm-hmm. So, there's always been, for me, here's this food of the Americas.
Yeah.
Now, of course, I wouldn't, want to start pushing people's brains to wonder how people ended up with corn up in the, way up in the north. If we, were to kind of believe this narrative that these people were isolated heathens or savages and didn't have a robust trade relationship with indigenous people throughout the Americas and the Caribbean, and with indigenous people in other parts of the world. But we sit down and we can throw down some turkey or
deer,
some venison, some sweet potatoes or yams, and so that part of the narrative has been there.
Yeah.
And
the food part.
The food part, and really, when it comes down to stripping away the humanness of the other, a lot of what we're left with is food and holidays, and we do this with many different groups. So we might end up with salsa as our number one condiment, but we can't stand the thought of those people being in this country.
Right.
But and I think that as we started out the talk, I don't see anything wrong with observing a day of giving thanks. Of course, how we interpret it in my family, it's we're thankful for our health, and we're thankful for our family, and we're thankful for the things that we have, and so it's not really an observance of the more Americana narrative, I guess. Although that doesn't make us less American or whatever. But I think there's nothing wrong with people learning more accurate depictions of history and negotiating within themselves or negotiating within their families what they choose to honor or what they choose to be thankful for. I'm looking forward to watch football tomorrow, even though I understand the relationship between contact sports and kind of violence in general.
Right.
and
Ritualized
familial
warfare.
Violence, within family structures. So I can still, find a relationship between my knowledge around violence and my interest in watching football on TV.
Right.
So.
And, we're coming up on this weekend with the Civil War, on a holiday that was created during the Civil War. I want to read a handout that you give in classes that was written by Thomas Ferguson, who I assume by context is Algonquin, or at least Native. And what do you think of when asked about Thanksgiving? So we learn from the wisdom of our elders to thank the Creator for Mother Earth, Father Sky, Grandfather Moon, our uncles the four winds, our cousins the stars, and our brothers and sisters the animals. The Algonquins believed that humans were not distinct from or superior to nature, but rather part of nature. We also believe that animals could take human form. Moreover, we believe that a long time ago, humans and animals spoke the same language. Then there was a cataclysm that upset the universe, and only a few shamans retained the ability to speak with the animals. We thank the Creator for all our relatives, for what is good in the world, and for all our harvests, not just one crop, but all. We give thanks for the strawberry. It is the first berry of the new spring. We give thanks to the tree spirit for the warmth it provides in our fires and the saps that flow in the fall. We honor the animal spirit who laid down its life in order for the people to go on. Subsequently, we give thanks for each harvest year-round. It is said, when Creator created the universe, He placed His hand on the whole thing. So everything is spiritual. He never told us to separate anything, but to look upon everything that He has made as holy and sacred, and act accordingly with respect. The Thanksgiving the greater society celebrates occurs during a beautiful time of the year. Thus, Thanksgiving time means, as Joyce Sequelchi Hilfer so eloquently writes, the first hard freeze, the first spitting ice to rattle the dry autumn leaves, early morning frost crystallizes grass in rods of light, the last bit of bright color is gone from the woods. Thus, a time of great solitude and for giving thanks for all the gifts provided for us by the Creator, especially for our family's health and well-being. Thanksgiving traditionally denotes a harmonious time in the cycle of the seasons. So, it can be said and inferred from that Native people don't necessarily have one day to give thanks. You give thanks every day because no day is any less sacred than any other day. And from that piece of writing, we get a worldview that is way different than football and shopping, and basically bespeaks of a right relationship between us and two-leggeds and the other worlds. So in terms of looking at reclaiming some other things to reify this celebration in our times today, in terms of reaching out across differences, what do you think and what do you bring to your teaching practice in terms of looking at that when you bring this up in your class?
Well, yesterday I had some people knocking on my door. They were very polite, and I tried to be polite with them. And at one point, they were trying to talk about, I guess, the differences amongst people, and they were referring to, they were speaking of the past tense, but they were talking about European nobility on the one hand, and South Pacific cannibals on the other hand, and it was very odd for me to kind of work that through after they left.
Yeah.
I was thinking about South Pacific cannibals. I have many friends who are Maori and Native Hawaiians, and they don't come across to me as having been cannibals now or in the past, and so there was this disconnect for me, and then I was listening to someone on the radio today, and they were complaining about where they live, the lack of, what they were talking about Christmas music, but or holiday music, but they referred to it as European civilized music.
European civilized.
So this is the second time in 2 days that people have reminded me that there's, this civilized world, and then there's this other.
This sounds like Michael Savage or something like that.
Yeah, it was
Michael Savage.
It was Michael Savage.
Okay.
And so I think that, one of the things that I, invite the students to do is have a safe weekend. Many people are going to be traveling. I invite them to, honor the time off, however which way they're going to honor the time off. I think a lot of families kind of tend to have their own kind of micro traditions. Since in my family we started a family later, so we have a 4-year-old and a 4-month-old, and so now we're faced with our own micro traditions. So the things that we picked up from our families, and of course being members of this society, the things that we know people do, and then the things that we choose to do ourselves. And so I think that's I don't really push the students one way or the other. This is, even though I see this holiday in much the same light that I see, say, Columbus Day, I think it's easier for people to skip Columbus Day or just kind of check out during Columbus Day versus Thanksgiving. I think there's a lot more mythos caught up in...
And a lot more investment in the holiday as a holiday.
Yeah.
In terms of paying attention to it.
And, of course, what you brought up was the whole reality of Friday with people shopping and, kind of trying to get there early and kind of pushing each other, doing the elbow thing. And, in that way, it's kind of hard to imagine because yesterday, knowing that we were going to be doing DiversiTV, much of my Thanksgiving, quote-unquote Thanksgiving meal shopping had to happen yesterday.
Yeah.
And I was shocked by the volume of people
right.
and the level of intensity
yes.
at the stores that I went to.
They're not very thankful. They're kind of like frantic and savage, so to speak. Almost cannibalistic.
So, yeah.
I think it might be useful to, because this is what we do in ethnic studies anyway, is basically talk about some of the realities behind the myth. So let's kind of walk through some of the story. So when we talk about, if you go to slide, if you would. So in ethnic studies, we talk about the traditional canon, which is basically the Columbus discovered America narrative. Since, as we talked about, indigenous cultures give thanks to Creator not once a year, but after every harvest of agriculture or game, or even every day. And so this particular feast lasted several days. So from the indigenous point of view, which is part of the handout, and I basically took the liberty of selecting some stuff and not going verbatim because we don't really have enough time to do that. But, for example, one such celebration occurred in August of 1621 at Patuxet, a.k.a. or anglicized as New Plymouth in English, now known as Plymouth Rock. Now, in the narratives, they talk about the Pilgrims, which they didn't call themselves that, landed at Plymouth Rock. Well, in reality, they didn't land on the rock because wooden boats don't land on rocks very well. And this rock was actually up on shore and, has since been kind of like broken up by tourists and is a shadow of its former self about the size of this table that we're sitting at. So be that as it may. So the first historical event we're taught to picture as the first Thanksgiving is already a construction there. So August 11th, 1620, a cold and windy night. The Mayflower is forced to anchor in the Bay of Paumet, which is the indigenous name for what becomes known as Cape Cod. The Pilgrims were headed to Jamestown, Virginia. And of course, like Columbus, they were lost. Running low on supplies, religious leaders William Bradford, Edward Winslow, following a guidebook published in Europe entitled, quote, Virginia, richly valued, unquote, decide to raid graves for food. So go ahead, talk about that.
Well, this makes two things come to mind. One is based on the speakers from Tucson, Arizona, who were here last week, Roberto Rodriguez and Patricia Gonzalez. And at one point, Patricia, in an evening event, talked about having a doctorate, but not being the first doctor in her family, and talked about the healers, the indigenous healers in her family as the first doctors in her family. You know, so I started thinking about, you know, what it takes to have knowledge of the earth systems for planting, and for harvesting, and for hunting, and what it takes to be able to make your living structure out of nature, or your clothes, or, you know,
as opposed to a supermarket.
Yeah, I mean, it's like it'd be like watching Real Survivor.
Yeah,
you know, so that's one thing. And then I started thinking about I lived on a ship for 4 years, and I've made that passage back and forth between the East Coast, where my ship was stationed in Virginia, to Europe and the Mediterranean. So I'm thinking, okay, here are these people that have never been here before. They've been on this ship, and they didn't have all the bells and whistles that I had. And you're showing up, you have no expertise of the land, the environment, the people, the weather.
Well, not even in your own land that you left. You don't even have that expertise.
And, you know, to imagine that somehow they showed up and just by divine providence everything was fine and everything worked out for them. And no. You know, people took slaves and forced them to teach them how to plant. You know, they did. You know, it is absolutely true that they, you know, and so here, these are people who are a certain type of Christians. So I'm assuming that they must have had some sort of tradition that if they were in Europe and they were at, say, a graveyard, most likely a graveyard at that point would probably be part of a greater grounds of a church, they would not go to a grave and start digging it up.
No.
They would not do that, I'm assuming.
Right.
But somehow it was okay for them to show up and start doing that, you know. And what they did was what most colonizers have done throughout the history, is they show up to a settlement or a town or a city or whatever, and they basically discover, you know, they discover structures that are already built. They discover fields that are already planted. They discover, you know, tools that are already made, and that is how they survived, and that is how they created what became all of this.
Yeah.
So.
And I guess, you know, it must be said, you know, the first place they went, Plymouth Rock is not the first place they went. They went to Cape Cod. They're discovered by the Nausetts, who are a band of the Algonquin Nation, who chased them off of the Cape because of the sacrilege of grave robbing, and then they go to Plymouth as the next stop, which, you know, since the Algonquins, as we talked about, were a larger part of the League of Delaware, who'd been basically dealing with, you know, other Indian nations, European slavers, and the particular group of the Algonquins we know as the Wampanoags, who are known indigenously as the people of the Eastern Gate because of what their particular place in the native world, because it must, as we've talked about before, there's extensive trade routes, extensive ritualized, you know, place in culture. You know, these are not quote-unquote savages, but extensive, complex, urban, if you will, civilization. So Wampanoags in particular did not fully trust white people because of the slavers that raided coastal villages, but encountering the so-called Pilgrims, their spirituality taught them that they were to give charity to the helpless and hospitality to anyone who came to them with empty hands, which, even though those hands were actually filled with stolen goods, they didn't necessarily know that. So the Wampanoags and another Algonquin band kind of taught them to farm and provided them with food, thus saving them from starvation. It should be said that one of the things that, go to slide if you would, Samoset, a Sagamore chief of yet another band of Algonquins, the Mortegons, was on a fishing trip visiting the Wampanoags when he walked into the Pilgrims' camp on Friday, February 16, 1621, bidding them welcome in English. So lots of native folks were actually familiar with the English language as well as French and other the languages of Europeans, and being multi-fluent in lots of other languages, were able to converse with them to their surprise. So, hello, Englishman, Samoset says. They noted he was a man of free speech as far as he could express his mind. He showed the Englishman 2 arrows, one blunt, one pointed, asking, in effect, are you friend or foe? He spent the night with the Pilgrims, described the countryside, the province, every Sagamore, the numbers in their bands, and left in the morning. And the reason he's doing that is saying, this is not uninhabited land. There are lots of numbers here. You need to be watching yourself. And he returned later to Squanto, who was known to the settlers as Squanto. And so this is where Squanto, enters the story. He agreed to live among the settlers and serve as a translator, even though, again, he was familiar and returned from slavery. So this is another kind of, from the native point of view, adding to that narrative that, we get in storybook. The Massoit, another figure, a sachem of the Wampanoag, also sent another native, Habamak, and his family to live near the colony because he didn't entirely trust Tisquantum. And actually, native oral tradition, Wampanoag oral tradition, says Massoit ordered Tisquantum killed after he tried to stir the English against the Wampanoag. So he wasn't entirely a trusted figure. Tisquantum is, in fact, viewed as a traitor by native people for collaborating for his own personal gain. Another thing that doesn't make it into the historical native. So he was a Patuxet who had been captured by European slavers, shipped off to England. And as we've already actually told this story. So the following fall, after hunting fowl, the Pilgrims harvested 20 acres of corn, 6 acres of barley and peas, thanks to Squanto's tutelage. They were a subsect of Puritans, and far from being religious refugees, eventually engineered coming to power in England and abolishing Parliament for a time. So this is also another part of the narrative we're not necessarily told. Poor, helpless, refugees who, are escaping religious persecution. They invited the sachem Wusaquamin, also known as Chief Massoit, to celebrate their harvest. He brought 5 deer, 90 men, so the first Thanksgiving, bird, corn, peas, roasted venison, and beer, because they supplied the beer because they had barley. So the feast lasted 5 days and was celebrated as a treaty by which the Pilgrims could have a permanent settlement. Though, of course, if the chief had known about the desecration in search of corn to eat and personal artifacts of the dead to sell to finance their debt, he probably wouldn't have been so friendly. And had he known that in 2 years the massacre of the Pequot and the enslavement of the survivors would be cause for a separate Thanksgiving celebration by the Europeans, thus one of the first uses of the term Thanksgiving in the prayers of the colonists, thank you for delivering the Indians away from us. So, and had he known that in 10 years the children of these Pilgrims would behead his son and leave the head on the fort for 25 years, then sold the Wampanoags and other Algonquin bands into slavery into the Mediterranean, the West Indies, let's say there would have been a different outcome. Now, not to...
So we take a time machine and we grab some of those folks from back in the day and we bring them here, and the Pilgrims are looking around like, damn. And the Indigenous people are like, damn.
We should have had better immigration laws.
Although, I guess this Friday we have some kind of Native American Heritage Day or something like that. That Congress has approved just for this Friday.
Really?
Not for the rest of the existence of this country, but just this one time.
Native American Heritage Day?
Native American Heritage Day. They had to turn it into a Heritage Day, I guess, by what I read in the news, because they didn't want to turn it into an actual holiday where people would get time off and
paid time off, right? Can't have that.
So, yeah.
Well, what are we to make of all this then? So, I mean, certainly we in ethnic studies get accused of, well, hey, this puts a damper on my holiday. You know, why do you have to bring up all this stuff? You know, over and over again. I mean,
we didn't even talk about the industrialization of turkeys and how they get so large.
Factory farms of, these animals, right? Yeah.
Sarah Palin and the rendering machine that she was speaking in front of the other day.
Yes.
But
no, we haven't talked about that, and let's not. Why spoil people's appetites for now? But I mean, one of the things that we could, I think should talk about then is looking at restoring a more healthier, less addictive model towards looking at how we look at each other and celebrations in general. I mean, you talk about heritage, so why celebrate this heritage in a non-holiday? If we were to take something more serious with that, because, we in ethnic studies, I talk about, the Columbus Day as, the Taino made first contact with a particular European at Guanahani Island on this day. And the Taino were not unfamiliar with Europeans, or they were not unfamiliar with other people. So telling that larger story.
Even in people that might watch this on TV, I would ask them to not take that step. It's very classic within Western culture to just do that binary. Everything's either or, yes or no, good or bad.
Right.
Now I know this history, so somehow my holiday is ruined or whatever. And no, there are multiple realities that unfold. There are multiple stories. It's how I see the history of Oregon being approached. Someone can't tell me that there is not enough time in the day for children to learn the full history of Oregon.
Right.
Not just the native history of Oregon, not just the presence of African Americans or Spanish explorers or Latinos or the people that came in covered wagons.
Right.
There's room for everyone's narrative.
Right.
And I really feel like that's what we're talking about here, is that there is room for multiple narratives.
Right.
And,
history has to be, the story told from the point of view of everybody that was there. Let's start there, just telling that story. And so that's part of it, not downing people's holiday, but okay, this is a story you haven't been told. What you've been told is a construction. Just like a lot of things that are constructions. And so, knowing the truth and, hoping that some part of the truth gets to set you free is one way of telling and one reason for telling this narrative. And
well, that's why, the first thing I started talking about was that we observe the time. In honor of my vegan friends and my vegetarian friends aside, I'm going to be gnawing on my big old drumstick. I'm going to observe the time.
Yeah.
And I still can know this history.
Yeah.
I don't see any problem with living out these multiple realities.
And I think there's some, basically, if we were to show, you're basically using Lowen's book, Lies My Teachers Told Me, right, as part of the narrative. And so, when we look about, the stories that we were told Columbus discovered America, the Pilgrims, met the friendly Indians at Thanksgiving, and everything was rosy thereafter, and thus creating our great country, etc. I think what has to be done is, like, the reason that we bring this stuff up is so that it doesn't happen again. Because, one, in America, slavery's returned to America today in the 21st century. And just because it isn't us sitting at this table so much, but now yet another set of illegally imported folks, making our Nikes or whatever it is that they're making, they are. I don't know what the president-elect is going to be doing about eliminating slavery, but that's certainly not part of the economic stimulus that we have in mind.
Well, it's like that idea of Squanto going home and realizing that he's the last person in existence of his group.
Right.
And me reading an article recently about this Indigenous woman who was the last traditional speaker living.
Right.
I mean, a language
these
that was
things are
cultivated
continuing
through
to
thousands of
happen.
years.
They're not back in the past. They're
No.
still happening now. Right? So what happens to the next Thanksgiving-like event, which, continue to happen? So, I mean, that's one of the pieces about bringing up the past. That's not all of the past.
I think Thanksgiving is probably the only time that we actually have a national consciousness where the average person might even think about Indigenous people.
Yeah.
But of course, it's also from a more historical perspective. So.
Right. Yeah. Because, again, right, to the degree that we think of Indians or the Indigenous, and it's in a comfortable, sequestered, almost sports team like kind of way, Washington Redskins, Cleveland Indians, and the kind of like the cigar store there. Oh, well, aren't they extinct? I mean, ironically, one of the things that came up with, certainly during the presidential campaign. Okay, so I've been to Foxwoods, which is the Pequot's casino. So, there's an issue with them about, okay, they had, you go to their museum, and it's, like several $100 million worth of museum with computer-animated, exhibits and things like that, and they have a mock-up of the fort where those 700 folks were massacred, right? And then they were broken up and, sent into slavery alongside Africans who were also being enslaved, and that's where the black folks mixed in with them in terms of first contact in the 1600s. And so then they become a tribe of black Indians, and they have the third largest casino on the planet through the good offices of John McCain, who's on the Senate committee for those affairs. So could we say that the Pequot have now rebounded from that massacre 300 years ago because they have the largest casino on the planet?
Well, I mean, sure, let's say that, and let's say that Barack Obama, as president-elect, makes racism obsolete.
Right. We're post-racial now. Yes. I mean, that has been started.
Even though the night that Barack Obama was elected, there were, can we say, dozens or hundreds of white people also elected to office throughout the country.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's, I don't know, maybe it's relative, maybe it's not.
Well, we certainly do have a lot to give thanks for. And I'm glad to be able to take the time to do that and to count those blessings. But certainly, the work isn't over. Certainly the trends that were begun on that, August night in the 1620s, still continues because there's still a lot of stuff going on. So, do you have any final thoughts?
No, just like you, I have a lot to be thankful for, and Thanksgiving is just one of the days of the years that I give thanks.
Yeah. So, what are you going to be doing?
Going to be doing food and talking about the cultural traditions. We got the fake tree going up this weekend, and football to watch. It's either Oregon by 1 or Oregon State by 21.
Either way. So if you like what you've seen, be sure to email us at liveclass@lanecc.edu. Put DiversiTV in the subject line. And we'd like to know what you thought about this show and other shows in the past, and what you'd like to see in upcoming shows in the future in terms of what we can focus on. Because we welcome that feedback, and eventually we'll make this into a class, basically, because this should be talked about not only just during Thanksgiving, but other issues that are pertinent to the ongoing struggle for human freedom and greater dignity. So this has been DiversiTV. Go well, stay well.